Today we'll look into the future. How can we make the transition within the planetary boundaries? We look at the unique Swedish report with different scenarios without economic growth. This is the Evolution Show. Welcome to the Evolution Show. I'm your host Johan Landgren. In the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of alarming reports on the state of the planet's health that are indicating that we've reached the planetary boundaries or are close to reaching the planetary boundaries. The extinction of the species and the collapse of the ecosystems, not to mention the climate change. The current economic system is simply not sustainable and need to change. But how can it even be done without causing sustained crisis for human societies? A comprehensive Swedish report that is quite unique takes a look at the different challenges we have in a very holistic way. And with me today to understand and discuss this report is Mikael Malméus. Welcome to the Evolution Show.
Thank you very much.
You're one of the researchers behind this very comprehensive report. I think it's about 25 researchers, something like that.
Not that much. I think we were 17 in the end.
Okay.
Some came and some went.
Yeah.
But somewhere around 17 researchers.
Yeah. And there are also a collaboration with a lot of organizations and authorities.
Yeah. We had a reference group. We had an international reference group of researchers, and then we had collaborations with municipalities and companies and different stakeholders, so that we had a dialogue really during the work. Yeah,
and your role in this, you're a researcher. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background before we go into the report.
I began as a natural researcher, natural scientist. But then maybe a little bit more than 10 years ago, I found out that economics is maybe it's really the answer lies much more in the economic sector or in the economic sciences. I thought that as a scientist, natural scientist, we know almost everything that we need to know. Now we need to act. And then I thought, the big obstacle is the economy. So I took a turn and went more into economics. So now I call myself an economist and a natural researcher.
Yeah. And I think that's a great combination. I think oftentimes we have experts, so-called, within different fields that don't understand each other. So I think that's a good choice you've made there. I would also like to mention that this report, you have different authorities. I could mention the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI, and you have also the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, MSB. And you have KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, in this report. There are several researchers from KTH. You have from Lund University, and you are from
IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute.
Yes, Swedish Environmental Research Institute, exactly. So there's really a great mix here, I think, and it also points to the seriousness of this report. I mean, it's not just some I would say like think tank or something, which could be they could produce great things as well. But this kind of broad perspective from different, authorities, organizations, research and so on, shows that you've put in a lot of effort in this. And it's 4 years, I think.
5 years.
5 years even, yeah. And you presented the report late last year, November.
Yeah, November.
Yeah. And then you had also, you followed up the report with different panel debates and discussions with pretty famous people here in Sweden, different experts. And you attracted some, at least, media attention, I think. You wrote an editorial piece in Dagens Nyheter, I think.
In the Svenska Dagbladet.
Svenska Dagbladet, Svenska Dagbladet, one of the major Swedish magazines. But I was hoping for more, to be honest. I think the report it constitutes a lot of important aspects, and especially looking at our challenges when it comes to climate, sustainability, and so on, in a very holistic picture. So that's a perspective. So we're going to get into that soon. So you told you a little bit about your background. Could you tell us a little bit about the project and what your role was in this project, or is perhaps, if you're still working on a follow-up or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those 17 researchers, we were all scientists, academic scientists, and then there were some organizations which were providing input into the scenarios. So what we did was we developed 4 different scenarios, but in the beginning we had many more. We had like 20, 30, I don't remember, tentative scenarios, but then we had a selection procedure which ended up with 4 scenarios, and the researchers, together with the other organizations and stakeholders and reference groups, developed those scenarios during the project. So we had several meetings during the time and so on, and then we explored the scenarios in different aspects. So I'm an economist, so I explored the economic implications of the 4 scenarios, and someone else was a mobility researcher trying to explore how could transportation work in this scenario and that scenario and so on. So we were a multidisciplinary team working with different aspects of those 4 scenarios.
And just to specify or clarify, those scenarios are the collaborative economy, local self-sufficiency, automation for quality of life, and circular economy in the welfare state. So these are the 4 future scenarios you focused on, and they are all looking at the future without economic growth.
Yeah. So that's one condition that, I mean, we're saying that, I mean, we wanted to explore, because most future scenarios or extrapolations, I mean, if you look at like projections from the government, they try to calculate how much do we need to spend on pensions, healthcare and so on in 2020 to 2030 and so on. They're all expecting the economy to keep growing, so that's sort of always built into every projection of the future. And we thought, why is it like that? And so there were several reasons for us to do something else, but one reason was that no one has ever looked at what would happen if the future doesn't look like it. I mean, we have had economic growth for 200 years, so it's natural that we think it will continue, but maybe it won't.
No.
So all the 4 scenarios, we're saying that, okay, we don't have economic growth. We will have, you could call it a steady state economy, which is not the same as I mean, it will be dynamic economies, but we won't have a growing economy. And they're looking at 2050. It's important to say that as well. So we're quite far in the future.
Yeah. And the case is basically Sweden, but you could apply this to many countries, I think, especially Western countries.
I mean, they would be quite similar in other countries as well.
Yeah. Okay, so what would you say is the major differences? We can go into, or maybe we can start with, could you describe those 4 scenarios a little bit, and also compare them? What's the biggest differences and similarities?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we start with the local self-sufficiency, it's we're thinking of a future where we don't trade so much between regions, where we don't, the production is local and the life is local. We don't travel so much. Of course, we're not saying that we don't travel at all and that we don't trade at all, but we do it to a much smaller extent. And the defining entity is the household. So people will live in families and so on, and the household will be and the municipality will be like the unit that you will focus on. And then we have collaborative economy, which is more like the commons. So people will work and live in networks. So it's in that scenario we don't imagine a household to be the important unit, but more the neighborhood. But also commons on the internet, so we can collaborate in different aspects with persons perhaps we don't know, which we meet on the internet. And the collaboration and sharing is the defining feature. So I mean, in the local self-sufficiency, to go back, the reason why it's sustainable is because we have this local production. That's one strategy actually to be sustainable. And in the collaborative economy, the sustainable feature is that we share many things. So we can lower production and consumption by sharing things. So that's how we can reduce our material footprint. And then we have the automation for life quality, and that is an extrapolation of the trend with automation and artificial intelligence and robotization, automatization, things that we can see today, but which we extrapolate quite far into the future. And one thing that happens there is that instead of, that's something we talk about today already. How many jobs will be lost due to automation? How many jobs will be lost due to artificial intelligence and so on? And in that scenario, we don't see it as a problem. We see it as a possibility. So we don't need to create more jobs. Actually, we can't create more jobs because that would put further pressure on production. We need to produce more things if everyone has to have a work. So in this scenario, we rather think that we will work 10 hours per week. So we will have much more leisure time.
I was thinking of something when I read about the local self-sufficiency scenario. I thought that it distinguishes itself from the others in a very important way, and that is that in all these scenarios except that one, you point to a lower self-sufficiency level than today. In the self-sufficiency model, you have in terms of imported stuff like food. So you have 90% self-sufficiency in that model, and in automation you have only 25%. So you're basically importing 75%. And the others were 50%, I think, both the collaborative economy and the fourth one, which is
circular economy, which I haven't told you about yet.
Yes.
But
Good. But so, and I can see that as a problem in a system. If you have let's say a self-driving machine, you call the whole society a self-driving machine. Everything is just working in the automation for quality of life model scenario. But that's basically, it depends on that the imported goods are coming as they should in time, and just in time basically. But let's say we have a crisis of some sort, and the imported products are not arriving as they should. Let's say food, for example. Then you have a huge problem, and we have a debate in Sweden right now because of the recent years. The last year's drought and the fires, and we have a discussion about emergency preparedness, building up the resilience in the Swedish society. And if we compare to other countries in terms of self-sufficiency, the 50% level we are at today is actually among the lowest in the whole Europe. So, and that's where we are today. And if we like play with the idea that we have the automation for life, quality of life model, we will decrease that to 25%. So half of today, which is already low. And I think, in a future where everything works like a machine, everything is just perfect, we have no problem. But for me, I always, I'm a guy who thinks a lot about resilience and emergency preparedness, because if you look historically, we know that in longer periods of crisis, we tend to have resilience on our own. You can manage for a short period of time, and we know that people they help as much as they can in crisis. Contradictory to what most people think, that people will just fight over everything, but humans try, actually, that we see that in crisis over and over, that they help each other. But that doesn't help if we have we import the stuff, and they also have a crisis for some reason, or we have interruptions of the transports and so on. So do you see a problem or a benefit if you look at the self-sufficiency scenario? Have you discussed this, that this could be a problem for the other scenarios? We will lower the self-sufficiency.
Yeah, I see what you mean. We have discussed it, and you could say that 50%. You're absolutely right. Sweden has a low degree of self-sufficiency compared to other countries, but we wanted to have. It was not a major thing in the scenarios, so we simply wanted some going in. We wanted two directions. So if we see the 50% self-sufficiency as what we have today, and that would be the normal, and then we have the local self-sufficiency that would have an increased self-sufficiency, then we wanted some scenario to have a lower self-sufficiency, just to be able to have these kind of discussions, because we're not saying that those scenarios are more or less realistic, more or less good. I mean, people can have different opinions. Probably people will say that in that scenario I like that aspect, but I don't like that aspect, and so on. They're actually we made them to have these kinds of discussions.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about the fourth scenario.
Yeah.
Also, so that we can
absolutely good.
have the full picture. It's the circular economy.
Yeah.
And I think people will be quite familiar with that, especially if they're interested in sustainability, because we're already moving into circulation and reuse and repair systems. In that scenario, we assume a quite strong state and quite strong companies, because we think that supply chains and production chains need to be coordinated to have these production systems where we can allow reuse and repair, and all the features of the circular economy depend quite much on that kinds of collaborations. And for that reason, we think that we need rather strong companies. But they're democratic, all of them. But we have a stronger state in the circular economy. We have quite weak states in some of the other, like more self-organizing societies.
And I would like to move back also to the collaborative economy scenario, because I came to think about mobility as a service, or shared transports, which is something that's a hot topic right now. And one of our previous guests talked about this extensively, and we're talking about different scenarios for that. And Anna Pernestål, she also is a researcher at the KTH, and she's working with this specifically, how we can increase the number of passenger per vehicle, because moving to automation and self-driving vehicles, it could actually increase the traffic, or the miles per vehicle traveled. It could double, because you're just sending away different vehicles to pick up stuff and run errands for you, but they're basically empty, or 75% empty, or even totally empty. So we need to share the vehicles, and it comes back to the collaborative economy. I think it's very interesting to see how that could develop. And I would also like to clarify that I don't think that these scenarios are mutually exclusive. I see benefits and pros and cons with all of them. Mm-hmm. But I personally think that there is a strong interest, and you're talking about this in the report as well, that people want to have more control of their food production and the localized economy and so on. But I also see that you can combine this with for example, in the countryside we lack transports. It's a huge problem, and I talked to Anna Pernestål, a previous guest, about this, that maybe we can have shared mobility on the countryside as well, so people can get from A to B and deliver stuff there, pick up stuff, have local stores and so on. So I think it's very interesting to see how these scenarios could come together. But one question I have is when it comes to the automation for quality of life is obviously AI. You said that you discussed this, and I wonder perhaps how these discussions have been, because there's like basically two schools now. One saying that we really have to be careful right now. We're like in the beginning of what can be the singularity curve, where everything changes, where we have basically an AI in every part of our society affecting us, and with decision making and so on, that could be either manipulated or it can run berserk. We can lose control of it. That's part of it. And the other part is that it could create amazing stuff, things we can't even imagine today, because basically we don't have the intellect for it. It would be like a super organism with all of humanity's intellect working thousands times what we can do together in seconds. So how have you talked about this? Can you see challenges for AI in all of the scenarios, or have you looked specifically at automation, and for that's closer to kind of?
Yeah, so I think none of us are AI experts, so it wasn't really in focus for us to. I mean, we're not exploring AI as such. We're thinking more of how societies can develop, and I think maybe, and we spoke about this before, that we might have missed some of the discussions that have been around AI, and I can't really say that I mean, technology is a possibility and a threat. It has always been. I think, I mean, we can see those discussions when machines were taking over workers' jobs in factories 200 years ago, 150 years ago. I think one of the, I mean, it's part of the discussions then are quite similar to today, but then of course there are also some new aspects. So I think you will probably, if you're really interested in AI, I think you could find you could have those scenarios as a kind of skeleton, but you need to fill it with some content, some more content than we did.
Yeah, but to your defense, I think the last couple of years, basically the whole AI debate has exploded. So during this period of time where you have written and researched this report, a lot of has been happening. So I can understand, like in the last couple of years, it's hard to just fathom everything, and basically there's new news coming out every day. One recent news about AI is that new AI now can actually play this game. What's called? Not Doom. It's it's first-person game anyway, where they can follow. Sorry. Wolfenstein. No, not Wolfenstein. It's anyway. It can actually collaborate with people playing a computer game, understand the difference between the teammate of yours and the enemy, and work in teams with other humans, indistinguishably from others. You have all these stories about beating chess machines and Go and everything. So, but that's just one of the recent news, and we have that's a discussion for a whole different program. But I just thought that this could be interesting to see. You can use the information in the report and add AI now and build a new kind of scenario, perhaps, or see different challenges. So
I think you're right, but I think also the idea of the report is something else. It's really, I mean, AI is really fascinating, and it has its limitations. I mean, obviously, what will you build all this AI technology from? What are the limits to AI in terms of resources and so on? You can have many discussions about it, but I think the point of our report is really to say, okay, we don't really know about the future. There's so many possible futures, and many people are into predictions, trying to say this is how it's going to be, and also into some kind of what do you call it? Predestination, that we cannot choose. We have to adapt to something. But really, I mean, that's how some politicians want us to think. They don't want us to make plans before the future. They think plans are scary. And they think that adapting to climate change means that we need some kind of planning economy, which is very scary, and it's very a threat to the free market and so on. But I think we need discussions about the future. We need to see that the future have so many different possibilities. It could be, I mean, our 4 scenarios are just 4 out of an infinite number of possible futures. So that's really the point, not to make a perfect illustration of AI or a perfect illustration of the collaborative economy. We try to pick up trends in society and say, what do we know today about AI? What do we know about the circular economy, the trends in that, and the sharing economy and so on. But I mean, obviously, if we would make the same project again, we would probably end up with 4 different scenarios. If we do the same scenarios in 10 years' time from now, we start again with the 4 scenarios, they will look completely different because we know so much more about different things. So yeah,
definitely. Now, and I would like to come back to also what you say the scenarios can lead to, and similarities. You say that we all can, which is a positive thing. I think that message I want to send here as well, that we can, within all the scenarios, reach a climate we can address the climate issue if we start now, and we can address also equality issue of sharing sharing this planet with others. today we have, division in terms of how many hectares, for example, we have as a per person in Sweden compared to other countries, which is unsustainable today. But we can go from, I don't remember the exact figure, but something like 3 or 4 hectares down to 1 or something. And that's necessary, you say also in the report, to reach, to stay within the planetary boundaries. So that's a great, I think, message we can. We have to say here, to be clear with. But you also say that there are other areas that will be difficult, especially social challenges that will come to this. I mean, obviously there are so many big changes that will come with all these scenarios, regardless if it's the collaborative economy or the self-sufficiency. It will all require that we start to think about redistribution of resources. So that's something I would like to come back to. How can we is that a correct interpretation that that's one of the key challenges we have in the report?
Yeah, I would definitely say that redistribution is key in all futures, including the 4 scenarios. And we addressed it a little bit in economically. So we're saying, for example, in the automation scenario, it's very important that, I mean, in the current economy, people earn their living from either working or owning. And if in the automation scenario, people won't be working so much, someone will be owning all those machines. So how do we make sure that the owners of the machines don't get all the money and the rest of the population is extremely poor? So that we're discussing a basic income, we're discussing capital taxes and so on. We don't have a final answer, but we're discussing it there. And also in the sharing or the collaborative economy, there's a risk that people who don't have access to all these networks, for some reason they're not good at collaborating, so to speak. You don't have a strong state that distributes everything. You have to be skilled in collaboration with the collaboration tools on the internet and so on. So how can that, what kind of problem will that create, and how can they be solved and so on? So you're absolutely right that there are challenges.
Yeah, and before we move on, I'd like to just put this report in a historical context, and also to pinpoint the importance of the report. If anyone doesn't think that we need to change this current paradigm of economic growth, and just to make it clear and to understand it, put it in a context that people can understand. I mean, the current model of economic growth, it's devastating for our future, and it's totally unsustainable on a planet with finite resources. That's in the essence what it's all about. And there's a famous American physics professor called Albert Bartlett, and he was lecturing at college in US, in Denver, I think it was, and he has held over 1,000 lectures just explaining the exponential function. And he always takes this example with bacteria growing from basically nothing, and people don't realize that it's too late until 5 minutes to 12. Like, that's when you discover that suddenly all this bacteria has grown from basically nothing to taking over everything. But he says that this is a famous quote from him. He says that humans' greatest shortcoming is her inability to understand the exponential function. And I would like to emphasize this from the start here, that infinite exponential growth on a finite planet is physically impossible. And it's not a matter of opinion, regardless of the economic theories that we are presented with. And growth can only be sustained as long as there are enough resources, in particular cheap, accessible energy. And just to take an example from today, that let's look at China, for example. They often mention that right now they have a growth of about 6% per year. And that might not sound so much, and during a short period of time, you could have 6% per year. But today, China is already the second largest economy in the world after the US. But China is, for example, already the biggest energy user. So we take this 6%, and with the cheap energy, the fossil energy they have today, they need natural gas and specifically coal. And today, they consume half of all the coal in the whole world. So there is rule of thumb you can use here is called the 72 rule, which basically helps you to calculate the time it takes to double anything. And if you take 6% and divide it, 72 divided by 6, you get the number of years until something doubles, in this case China. So it would take 12 years for China to double its economy with a growth of 6%. And what does that mean? It means that they would consume all the coal in the whole world in 12 years. And this is basically, I mean, it's only possible if all of the rest of the world just leave all their coal. And that's just to make an example of...
Yeah, it's a good example, because I think the counter argument is usually, but hey, we're getting more efficient.
Yeah.
But that's partly true, it's partly false, but in 12 years' time, you don't shift from coal to wind power or solar power. You can shift it over a longer time period, perhaps. But I mean, it won't happen in China. In 12 years' time, they will still be using a lot of coal. Yeah. I mean, we didn't use... I mean, of course, we can use other resources than coal.
Yeah. And my point is just to show the exponential function. And you can have positive sides as well. You can take the example of Swedish electric vehicle registrations. And recently, the number of electric vehicles in Sweden, counting the second quarter in Sweden, it was 21,447 battery electric cars. So not hybrids, just battery electric cars. If we think about the number of doublings it would require, if you look back between 2017 and 2018, the doubling, or you could say doubling, was every 13 months. So 60% doubling, 60% the first year, but after 13 months you have a doubling. And if you take these doublings from the 21,447 during 9 years, or 9 doublings, 9 periods of 13 months, then in only 9 years, the number of electric cars in Sweden would go from around 21,000 to 5.5 million battery electric cars. That's exponential growth. And I don't think people realize how fast things can change, both for the negative, but also for the positive. I'm not saying that we need 5.5 million electric cars, but it also shows that something that's hard to imagine for people today can happen very fast once you take the necessary steps. And that's also something you are clear about in the report, that we need to change our vision in order to take steps to make the big change. And I think that's really something I took out from the report, a good message, I think, to people that yes, the challenge is immense. It's super difficult, especially in certain areas when it comes to the social change. Not so much maybe the material change, because I think humans' ability to change been shown in history is quite amazing. But it's harder now when we have so many different interests coming together, and they all want different things and so on. So, but I would just take another example before we move on, which is the debate about exponential growth, economic growth, has been around for many years. So 42 years ago, there's a famous speech to the nation by the incumbent president in US at the time, Jimmy Carter. And it was following obviously the oil crisis in 1973, and the very famous report, which we have to mention here since we talk about economic growth, is of the Limits to Growth by Club of Rome. And I noticed also that the Club of Rome was maybe Anders Wijkman or someone were in your report. But I'm just going to read very shortly what he said, because I think just at the beginning of his speech, because it's relevant, I think. I'll come back to why. So Jimmy Carter said, 1977, in national television, he said like this: "We must not be selfish or timid if we hope to have a decent world for our children and our grandchildren. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources. By acting now, we can control our future instead of letting the future control us. Many of these proposals will be unpopular. Some will cause you to put up with inconveniences and to make sacrifices. The most important thing about these proposals is that the alternative may be a national catastrophe. Further delay can affect our strength and our power as a nation. Our decision about energy will test the character of the American people and the ability of the President and the Congress to govern this nation. This difficult effort will be the moral equivalent of war, except that we will be uniting our efforts to build and not to destroy. And I can go on, but this is the beginning of this very interesting speech, which I highly recommend people to listen to, because it talks about our dependence on resources and also about, especially about conservation, thinking about saving energy and, you know, going back to balance basically with nature, which we totally have lost. And after hearing his speech, I came to think about James Schlesinger. He was an advisor at the time to Jimmy Carter, and I was visiting a conference in 2010 where he was speaking. He was the first Minister of Energy in the U.S., and he knew about the Club of Rome report. So I'm sure he had consulted and gave advice to Jimmy Carter when he wrote this report. And my point is just that this issue has been around for 42 years, but now the moment is ripe. And I think there's no coincidence that Sweden now has written this report, or Swedish researchers. So I really thank you for that, because I've been waiting for a kind of report like this for a very long time. So that was just a sidestep, but let's go back to what you do in the report. You look at three different regions or communities. You look at Malmö, one of the biggest cities in Sweden, and you look at Övertorneå, and you look at Alingsås. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about the differences about them and why you chose these regions?
Yeah, well, they're obviously quite different. Geographically, they're the southernmost part of Sweden, Malmö, and the northernmost part of Sweden, almost Övertorneå. And we wanted to test our scenarios. So they were involved in developing the scenarios, but more than that, they were involved in using the scenarios. So we went to the municipalities, to the planning departments, and asked them to discuss what would the four scenarios mean to them. And it's quite interesting to see that in the northernmost part, the local self-sufficiency scenario were considered a quite positive scenario. They think, oh, this is a good future. Because they're struggling now with they're already having a low growth society. Actually, people are moving out from Övertorneå. They're not growing as a society. So they were actually welcoming us to say that you can have an economy without growth, and this is how it can look. And they said, okay, local self-sufficiency is something positive. But on the other hand, in Malmö, they thought that, oh, that sounds like the Stone Age. The local they were more interested in the automation scenario and the collaborative scenario, which they have a lot of sharing and collaborative movements in Malmö. So they perceived those four scenarios quite differently, and that was the idea also, to have them reflect on the futures and having them getting their views and also finding pros and cons with them. So some of the conclusions that we have, for example, that in the collaborative economy, people might not feel included. That was something that someone said in those municipalities. We just realized, okay, you have a point there. So it was very good to discuss the scenarios with those planning departments.
And you chose them, I guess, because of their size and different things.
Yeah, we want to capture different kinds of exactly. Yeah. So I mean, Malmö is really a growing region. It's I mean, they're having it's already they still speak a lot about growth, and growth is something that comes mostly from population growth, or not mostly, but to a big part because of people are moving into that region. So it's quite different view on growth and something. But I mean, in many parts of Sweden, people feel more frustrated that they're not having growth and that they're lacking something. So it's very different perceptions of growth as a concept.
I read that you made quite a lot of interviews, I guess, with people in these different municipalities when it comes to, you ask them specifically that how can we manage a future without growth? How would it look like, or what do you think about this? And they all, or most of them, seem to have agreed that we cannot continue the way we do today. But at the same time, many of them couldn't see how we could make the transition from now to then within the current system. And I think people, especially in smaller towns, they feel a need to, as you say, grow the population. They think that maybe we basically have to do that, because otherwise people will just move. What do you think about that? Was that kind of the interpretation you had with people, that they and at the same time, I just would add also that you show that there are people who have moved to started to think about localizing and so on already. So you sort of show both sides there. Is that fair to say, that you think that? Yeah.
I mean, there are people who I don't know exactly why people move out in the countryside, such a green waivers. They can do it for different reasons, but many do it because they think it's more sustainable, and they also feel comfortable with modernity. So it could be different reasons, but they obviously they are showing a possible future. And I think you can see pockets of all the scenarios in society. You can see the sharing economy, you can see the circular economy as well, and the local self-sufficiency. You can see examples of it in society, which is very good, which is very inspiring. But yes, you also asked about people moving out from smaller towns and rural parts of Sweden, and that's really a problem. And they feel that the only thing they can do in the current system is to try to attract capital, attract innovation, they need some kind of attractions in the market economy to get people move back there. And I think they all feel that this is a fight we're going to lose.
Yeah,
we're not winning this. So they really welcome something else.
Yeah.
For them, because if everyone competes for those kind of things, they're not the winners. They don't feel that they're the winners.
Yeah, I was going to bring up this later, but I think it's time. You have suggestions in the report for how we can move forward, how we can go from A to B. Especially, let's take the example of people in a countryside or a small community. How can they strive, or how can they flourish in a future without growth? And you mentioned base income, but in a different way. Not only base income, you say you connect it with complementary currency, which for me was very interesting. I wrote about this in my own book as one of the examples for a local community to survive. Because if you have capital moving from a small community just being drained out, people basically going to the town to buy stuff, but the money doesn't end up there. In some way it leaks out from the system. It doesn't stay in the local community. And a way to go around that is actually to have people come to a certain place, consume and especially not stuff, but services and things like that in the community, but the money stays there. And then you can make an exchange for the national currency if you leave, if you like, to use the money somewhere else. But it is possible, and you are actually suggesting that in the report, that it could be a possible way to have a complementary currency to make the money stay in the community.
So the idea is that you can only use that money within a certain radius. So it will with some kind of application, you would make sure that it's written on the money or something. If you have digital money, it could be even easier to say that, okay, this piece of money was printed at this place, then you can only use it within a certain radius. And that would be also issued as a basic income. So people would have access to this, a certain amount of money every month. That's the idea, and it's on the idea stage, so it hasn't been tried out. Probably there could be some problems with people exchanging it for the national currency, and then the money would leak out anyway. So we'd have to think about the design, but
yeah,
I think it's an interesting. It could be an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So we wanted to have it in one of the scenarios to as an idea.
I could add that it has not been tested in Sweden, but it's actually, I think, in the southern part of, I don't remember the German town now, but more than 300 or 400 companies has been included in that kind of system where they use complementary currency, and in Brixton in UK and several other places.
But not combined with the basic income, I think.
No, absolutely. So that's exactly right. And that's was kind of I thought was a great idea, a really interesting combination that could be tried out. I hope we try it in Sweden. It could be because we have this kind of debate now. How can we solve the basic income? The critics are saying people will just put it in their pockets and lay on the sofa all day, and others say that maybe if people just get 3,000-4,000 Swedish crown or something like that, they could embark on their dreams, to be innovative, be entrepreneurs, support. It's just instead of just you giving them a boost, instead of having them locked into the system. They can't do anything because they don't have any money. They don't own anything. They don't have any house. They don't have, a farm or whatever it is. So yeah, that's just something. But something I think also important to mention here is that you say in the report that we can have a future without growth, without GDP growth, that actually is better than we have today. It doesn't have to mean that we go to a long crisis. Financial crisis forever, if go to stagnation. Maybe you can just elaborate on that, because you mentioned that Sweden has had a doubling of the GDP the last 30 years, but at the same time, the same period of time, we've seen that the health system and the school service system has declined in terms of quality. So it shows that it doesn't have to mean that GDP growth is automatically something positive.
Yeah, that's my favorite topic.
Oh, great!
No, actually, I mean, it's. I think it's more and more obvious that GDP measures, and also, I mean, this is so important to stress that the GDP measures the value of goods and services. But if the value doesn't go up, it doesn't register as GDP growth. So if the quality of things are getting better, for example, let's take our mobile phones. They're improving all the time, but we're not paying more for them. We pay as much for a mobile phone today as we did 20 years ago. So it doesn't add anything to the GDP if we buy a smartphone compared to if we bought the, Nokia plastic stuff, which you hardly could send an SMS on. So I mean, that kind of technological improvement doesn't register as GDP growth. But when people start switching more and more phones, so that we have to buy a new phone every second year, that of course adds to the GDP, and also that more people are finding mobile phones attractive, that would add to the GDP. So that, I mean, it's really the volume of stuff, not the quality, which goes into the GDP. But at the same time, as we're the things that are that we're having more and more of, it's really stuff. Services we don't get more of, and the reason for that is that they're becoming more and more expensive, because when the GDP grows, we need to be able to buy all the new stuff, and that is that we do by increasing our salaries. So if the GDP grows by say 50%, then most of the salaries will also grow by 50%. So hiring a doctor or hiring a nurse or hiring a teacher will cost twice as much, or 50% more. So it will go more and more exactly in the same. The salaries are increasing in the same at the same pace as the GDP. So, and we can actually see that a doubling of the GDP doesn't get a doubling of the number of doctors or the number of nurses or the number of teachers. It's what we need to do is to spend a bigger part of the GDP on those things, and we're not doing that because we don't want to raise taxes, probably because it would hurt the economic growth. So we're putting growth before welfare. We're saying, no, we can't raise taxes because that would hurt our ability to grow. We need to lower the taxes. But when we lower the taxes, we have to fire teachers, we have to fire doctors and so on. So there's absolutely no connection between growth, no positive connection at least, between growth and welfare in that kind of welfare. We can have some improvements in technology, so probably we can cure diseases today that we couldn't cure before. I'm not sure if it has directly connection with growth, but you can assume that kind of technology improvement would have something to do with growth. But if you look more on the quality, the number of doctors and teachers, you wouldn't see any connection with growth. And then what would happen if we didn't have growth? That would be disaster, according to many economists. That would mean that companies would go bankrupt, and the banks would fail, and people would be heavily indebted, and governments would fail also on their budgets and so on. Because that's what we see during the short periods of time when we didn't have growth. Usually in all countries, except, in all normal countries where we didn't have any wars or so, we have only had continuous growth for the last 200 years. We have only seen that. So we have no experience of an economy without growth in any of those countries. Not in Sweden, not in the United States, not in any country. Not in any healthy country. So the only time when we have no growth is the short periods of time when we have economic crisis. And then some people draw the conclusions, okay, without growth, then we will have economic crisis. But I would put it the other way around. I wouldn't say that it's the lack of growth that causes the crisis. It's the opposite. There's something wrong in the economy. There's some unbalance, some kind of bad decisions taken somewhere or so on. And then you will have economic problems, and then afterwards you can register that as higher unemployment, increased number of bankruptcies and so on, and you will also register as a little bit lower GDP. But I think that has nothing to do with what would happen in the long run. It's basically mostly about expectations. So if we expect the economy to grow, then we make a lot of decisions based on that assumption. And then if we don't have growth, probably you wouldn't have taken those loans, you wouldn't have made those investments. So in the short term, you could see some kind of problems. But in the long run, if we don't expect growth, then we wouldn't make those decisions. We wouldn't make investments that are unprofitable. We wouldn't take on loans which we couldn't pay back and so on. So if we have other expectations on growth, then it will be no problem with a stable GDP. And that's also a reason for making scenarios, that we're actually saying that, okay, but maybe think about the future this way instead. Think about a future where the economy doesn't grow. That would allow us to make other decisions.
I came to think about this historian Joseph Tainter. He wrote a book called Complex Society, the collapse of complex societies, and he talks about the falling marginal revenue. With increased complexity comes the falling marginal revenue. And you mentioned that we expand, we grow, but the service declines. And it all comes back to that we add layers to layers of complexity, but in the marginal revenue is declining. And it has to do with the resource base, where the resources, especially energy, we have picked the low-hanging fruits. So when it comes to oil, it requires more and more energy to get the same amount of energy output. So it costs more energy to get the same energy. And that comes with a cost all the time. And at the same time, we're growing the cake. The number of people are getting more, and they want the same thing. So, for example, you mentioned, I think maybe you don't mention in this report actually, but that India, the level of lifestyle you have in India is like half a planet. It requires half a planet on average. If you live like an Indian, you're basically sound. You're living as you can survive. But if you live as a Swede or an American 5.5 planets, Sweden 4.3, I think, but an Indian half a planet. So that's okay. We can survive. Coming back to GDP, I think we have to totally think about the change, because it's not sustainable to continue like we do. And perhaps, as you mentioned in the report, the biggest challenge is short term. Our perception is that everything will just crash. And we have to go, obviously, through a crash period where we manage this challenge. It will not be easy in the short term, but as you say, in the bottom lies the core problem, is that the whole system is slowly, let's call it falling marginal revenue. The net energy, the net win for the whole society is falling. So if we continue like this, we're basically on the brink of collapse. So we have to change the system anyway. So why not start now?
Yeah, I mean, we're not saying that we're heading against a collapse, but I sort
but
of.
the logic is telling that.
I know that many people are saying it, and we're assuming that they may be right or not. I hope they're wrong, but anyway, I mean, even if they're wrong, it's still a good idea to think about not growing the economy, because the things that are growing are unsustainable. I mean, we're obviously not growing the health sector, we're not growing the school system, we're growing the stuff. That's what we're growing, the transport system, the consumption of material consumption, and that cannot continue anymore. So we need to think about another system. And I think what we're trying to show, I think we're visualizing different scenarios, but as economists, we have also shown that it's possible. We don't even have to go through these short-term crises, because all we need to do is change our expectations. Maybe it takes some time to change expectations, and maybe we won't have that time, and that maybe could lead to some kind of crisis. But it's not inherent in the system. It's more how we deal with it.
Yeah, that's I could add that if I would take the role as a hyper-liberal and think about, or economist, I would say that, well, we have one planet, but we're moving on to Mars, and we are going to exploit asteroids and everything, and that will lead to more resources coming in. But that's both a positively way of thinking and also a way of avoiding the problem we have on the planet, because still we could run this planet in a way that makes it inhabitable. So that's another thing. But another point, key point in the scenarios that we talked about is redistribution, and we talked about the base income, GDP. Let's move on. Okay, just to mention also another recent example. I don't know if you heard about it, but Malaysia and Philippines now, they're sending back their plastic garbage. It couldn't be recycled to the Philippines to Canada, and Malaysia say that no, we're not going to take care of these plastics because for several Western countries, because they are simply not recyclable. They were branded to be, but they were not. They were burnable waste and things like that. And also, it's just an example of that we reached a point now that it's harder for countries to take care of the waste. We need to recycle and reuse things. And I think my point there is that as long as you don't see the problem on your backyard, you sort of miss the problem. You don't you start to make take action. But now it's kind of like nature is sending the bills, back. We reached a point that
we're starting to get there. I think there's this famous environmental Kuznets curve. I don't know if everyone is familiar with that, but it's saying that as we're getting richer, the environmental problems are increasing, but at some point it will turn, so we can become richer while the negative impacts are decreasing. And that has been shown to be true for example, air quality in cities. At least in some places, you can see actually that we have better air quality today than we had before, but we're still getting richer. But for some environmental problems, including waste generation, there's absolutely no sign of the environmental Kuznets curve. So, I mean, we're growing the amount of the amount of waste at the same rate as we're growing the economy, but we have been able to hide it to some point, because I mean, as long as it's not so much, you can hide it. But when it becomes too much, it's impossible to hide it.
Yeah, and I'd like to mention, just to show another example, is that since we're talking about economic growth, I guess you've heard about this recent UN report on the extinction of species. And in one of the paragraphs, they actually state this, that, and I quote here, identified as a key element of more sustainable future policies is the evolution of global financial and economic systems to build a global sustainable economy, steering away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth. And that's quite clear. This is a huge report with numerous researchers from all around the world, which basically talked about that we have 1 million species on the brink of extinction, and a lot of things. They also talk about that more than 40% of the amphibian species are threatened right now. Almost 33% of the corals are threatened, and the mammals. And in this program on the Evolution Show, we talked about in the first program about the pollinators that are disappearing. And coming back, the bills are coming. We need to act now. And I think your report is quite clear. It shows both that we can make a change if we start now, and maybe that the biggest challenges are the social ones. It's not that we cannot make it, we cannot supply the number of people with food, for example. If you redistribute, which is key there, we can do that. So that's. Is it something you would like to add to we haven't talked about in the report that you think could be interesting to elaborate on?
Well, I don't know. I think we covered many important aspects.
I was also asking, are you going to continue the research now on this report?
Not on the report, not as a group. It's that number of researchers is not the optimal size for everything, but all of us are still interested in it, and we're still friends. So I guess we will keep collaborating. But we don't have a project right now. We have. I think most of us have other projects which relate to this project.
Yeah.
But as such, the project has ended.
Yeah. And your role now, how is your work continuing? Are you researching on something similar, or?
Yeah, I have different projects. One of the most similar or related ones is about rebound effects. So that's an economic concept. I think it relates a lot to the idea of economic growth. Basically, when you make things more efficient, efficiency could be a very good thing for sustainability. If we can do the same things more efficiently, then that would make us use less resources in theory. But in practice, because we want it comes as economic growth, so it's rebounding. So when we have more efficient cars, at the same time we drive more. When we have more efficient heating, at the same time we're building bigger houses. So we never ever reduce our use of energy or anything else. All the resources. It's a good parable in Sweden. They say that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. I think that's we're using more stones now than they did in the Stone Age. So it's completely irrelevant to say that. And yes. I think the same thing. We're not running out of the fossil age because we're running out of fossil fuels. No, but we're also. We have to decrease our use of resources, and the rebound effects, the different rebound effects are something that is a mechanism that make us not using the possibilities that efficiency give us.
Yeah.
So that's a project that I'm working on right now.
Then I'm sure you're familiar with Stanley Jevons and the Jevons paradox.
Certainly, yeah. So Stanley Jevons was an economist in the 19th century, and he wrote an essay called "The Coal Question."
I have the book here.
I imagine you have. I think actually I saw it in your book that you wrote something about it. So maybe all the viewers are familiar with it too. But he said he was actually amazed that, or maybe you can tell it better, but that they were becoming more and more efficient in the use of coal, but still the coal demand for coal was increasing all the time
because of the efficiency. So the easier you get something, if you lower the price for something, you can. More people can access it. So if you have, the example of the light bulb, for example, if you're selling a very expensive light bulb, you can only sell to a certain number of people. But if you lower the price and make it accessible to a broader population, you will sell more of them. And that's of course good if the product per se is sustainable. But if you have something that is not sustainable and not recyclable, you have a problem. You end up with a pile of light bulbs in this case, but
it's interesting to see that how many people are now lighting up their gardens. You see so many gardens with hundreds of light bulbs. You wouldn't see that when you had what you call the old ones.
You're talking about not light bulbs. The old ones are light bulbs, but you're talking about
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah. So anyway, but there are also different kinds of rebound effects. So one of them is, I mean, you talk about direct and indirect and interactive rebound effects. So another thing is, of course, that when things are becoming more efficient, you get more money left in your pocket, which you can use for everything else. So even if you start driving a little bit less, you would do something else for your money, and that would have some environmental cost always. And you can change the supply and demand in the economy by efficiency. So there are many different components of this. It's very interesting.
I would suggest, actually, I just came to think about that we talked about mobility as a service and self-driving cars. That could be something really hot topic to think about when you talk about efficiency. If you add just a lot of self-driving cars, you decrease the number of cars on the road, but the number of vehicles traveled per vehicle is increasing. So because of efficiency, you can call it, or automation, they will run longer and more often. So instead of staying like 95% still on a parking lot, you will have them going around everywhere. And if you don't share them, you have a huge problem, because they would just increase the number of vehicles per vehicle, and you have traffic problems and so on. So that's something you could maybe look into.
We will do it, because we're actually specifically looking at transportation. So
okay, great. I look forward to read about that. But if anyone is interested about following your work or read more about what you do, please share your info. Do you have a homepage, or you want to research?
For the project, for the report about Beyond GDP Growth, there's a webpage called. It's in Swedish. I mean,
you can mention it in Swedish. We have a Swedish audience as well.
So so it's called www.bortombnptillväxt.se. And there is a short English version, but most of it, and there are a number of reports and scientific papers in English. But actually, I think it's more material in English, but it's possibly less accessible because it's scientific reports, scientific papers. But the main report and the website in itself and the news are mostly in Swedish.
But you could I mentioned a little bit of the summary today, but there is at least 2 pages of summarizing this report in English. So if anyone is interested, I can recommend them. I put in a link to the report in the comments below, so people can look for that.
Very good.
So, but I would like to really thank you for a very stimulating conversation. And I learned a lot. It was interesting to hear your perspectives.
It was nice to be here to talk.
So with that, I'll conclude this talk of today. I really enjoyed this conversation, and if you enjoy the conversation as well, feel free to continue the conversation in the comments below. In the next episode, we'll talk to Ingmar Renskog. He's an entrepreneur and the founder of a new social network platform for discussing sustainability and climate called We Don't Have Time. If you want to see the videos as soon as they come out, consider subscribing. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks for the next episode.